There are a number of ways to access Home Assistant remotely, from VPNs such as WireGuard and Tailscale, or using Nabu Casa, which is the Home Assistant cloud, or Nginx Reverse Proxy, or Duck DNS. I've covered a lot of these in my videos already. So today I want to talk about another method. This method uses Cloudflare as a proxy between the internet and your Home Assistant instance. This takes a little bit more work to get set up, and I'll talk about my thoughts on that later on in the video. For now, let's go ahead and get started. Before we start talking about configuration, I want to talk about a couple of requirements first. You need to make sure that you have your own domain name already, and you need to make sure that you have your DNS servers pointed to Cloudflare for that domain. Don't be afraid to get a domain name. They're easy to set up. You just go to a registrar, and there are a lot of them out there. I happen to use Cloudflare for mine, and it makes it easy to set up the registration and the DNS all in one interface. All right, so once you have a domain name and you have it pointed to Cloudflare, let's go ahead and get into some of the configuration and other considerations. The next thing you want to consider is the port that you're going to use on all of this. Cloudflare only has a number of ports that they will forward or proxy HTTPS traffic on, and that's listed on their website. These ports are the only ports that you can use for sending proxy traffic through Cloudflare, and that's HTTPS proxy traffic. Now in Home Assistant, you can choose to set your Home Assistant port to one of these ports right here. And that's just dependent on your network configuration. If you want to do that, you'll go into File Editor. You can use whatever file editing or SSH terminal or whatever you want to do with this. Now, if you do want to set up a specific port in Home Assistant, you'll come into the HTTP section here, and you will just set server port to whatever port you want. Let's say we want to use port 2096, for example. The other thing to be careful about on these ports is none of the items on your network can have this already set up. So you have to choose a port that isn't in use already. I am not going to change my Home Assistant port in this case because I am using port forwarding on my router. I will send port 2096, and I am using port 2096 for this. I will send port 2096 externally into my Home Assistant instance on the default port of 8123. So I'll just do all of that at the router level, and I won't worry about setting up a network port. So change the port if you want to, otherwise just leave it as the default and then use port forwarding on your router to get it to Home Assistant. All right, so that's step one, and that's the first consideration. By the way, any changes you make in Home Assistant, you'll need to make sure you restart Home Assistant for those changes to take place because you're doing the changes within the configuration.yaml file. Now, the second step is to set up a subdomain in Cloudflare for this. And you'll go into the portal, click on Add Record. Now, remember, we're in the DNS settings for the domain that you've set up within Cloudflare. So you add a record, you'll set it up as an A record, and you'll set up the name, I'll call it remote, and then you'll put an IP address in here. And then we can leave the time to live as auto if we want to, and then you'll save that. And what will happen is any requests that come into cloud or come in for remote.mostlychrisdemo.com will then be sent to this IP address. But first it will go through Cloudflare's proxy. So I know this can get a little complicated, but just work with me on this. Think about it going from the internet to Cloudflare. Cloudflare looks at it and then sends it on to the Origin server, which is our Home Assistant instance. And you will have your port open and sending it through to your Home Assistant instance internally. Now, step 3 involves setting up an SSL certificate. And the way that works right now is if you go from the internet to Cloudflare Proxy, that actual transaction is encrypted because Cloudflare automatically creates those SSL certificates for you for the domain. If I go from the internet, remote.mostlychrisdemo.com, it will go to the Cloudflare proxy encrypted. But from Cloudflare to Home Assistant right now, that part of the path is not SSL or not encrypted. We want to make sure that we encrypt the path all the way from the internet through Cloudflare and into the Home Assistant instance. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to create an Origin certificate. So we'll come over here to SSL. We'll talk about Origin server certificates. and we will create a certificate. We're going to use these steps to create the certificate that we're going to put on our Home Assistant instance. You want the host names, including wildcards. So this *mostlychrisdemo.com and mostlychrisdemo.com are going to be what the certificate considers as valid domain names. So remote.mostlychrisdemo.com will be covered by this asterisk or this wildcard. You can choose how long before your certificate expires. This is totally up to you. Since it's an Origin certificate, I'm going to leave it good for 15 years. You can probably revoke that at some point if you really had to. And then you would click on create. I've already created the certificate, so I'm not going to go ahead and create it again. Now, once you create the certificate with this button here, you need to make sure you copy down your key, your private key, and the certificate. You will need both of those in order to do the next step. For example, if you create it and then you don't copy it and you come back over here to Origin certificate, you can download the certificate, but you can't download the key. So make sure that you have you copy the key and the certificate when you do the create step. Okay, the next step is to take the copied key and the certificate and put them onto your Home Assistant server. And for that, we're going to go into the terminal. If you don't have terminal here, you need to either add it to the sidebar or you need to install the terminal/SSH add-on. So in terminal we go. All right, now that we're in terminal, let's do a quick ls. And this is going to show us the directories we have. We want to be in the SSL directory. So I'm going to do a cd, change directory to SSL. Remember, these are just simple Linux commands. We're not doing any super in-depth administration of the system using terminal. So don't get scared of the commands. It's not a big deal. All right, so in the SSL directory, let me do a quick ls. You can see that we have some certificates and keys already here. I'm going to create a new file called origin2.pem, and I'm going to put our copied certificate into that file. So nano is the command I'm going to use. Origin2.pem should bring up a blank file. And I'm going to copy the file. Hopefully you've copied the file and the key or the certificate and the key and put them somewhere so you can get them again. I'm going to copy it from my notepad and I'm going to paste it in here. You got to be careful with this paste command. I don't know why that sub menu is coming up, but make sure you don't try to use the sub menu. Once this just straight paste shows up, hit the paste as plain text and you'll see the certificate here. And this is the entire certificate that we're going to be using. All right. And then you hit Control X and then we say Y for save the modified buffer. It will write the name that you already created. If you want to change this to something else, you can do that now. Just hit enter. And now if we do an ls, you'll see that we have an origin2.pem file. That is our certificate file in the SSL directory. Remember this is that because it's going to be important in a few minutes. The next thing we want to do is exactly the same thing. We will go ahead and put our private key. So I would do a nano. And I'm going to call this Cloudflare private key 2, because we already have a 1 here. So I want to create a 2.pem. I will do the same paste that I did just a moment ago and save it. I won't do it this time because we already have one, which I will show you here in a moment. Once you do all that, the next step is to go into Home Assistant again, and we're going to change a configuration in the configuration.yaml file. So we can either Control D this, which will close it, Control D, and then we'll go over to File Editor again, bring up our configuration.yaml file. Under the HTTP section, we want to make sure we specify the certificate and the key that we just created. And it's in the SSL directory, and we would just change this to Origin2, and then SSL key will be the SSL key that we just created as well. As long as those are both in the SSL directory, this is the way you set this up. The next thing is you need to use X forwarded for true in order to allow Home Assistant to use the proxies. And then you'll need to list the proxies that Cloudflare uses to proxy these HTTPS requests over to your Home Assistant server. If you don't do this, you're going to get a cryptic bad request message on the browser when you try to use this. So if I click on IP ranges, and it's cloudflare.com/IPs, you can see a list of the IPv4 and IPv6 IP addresses. You can also get those as a list of plain text. So all I did was copy these down as plain text, went back into Home Assistant's file editor, and I pasted them in here. And then I formatted it correctly for YAML. So I put the hyphen in front of all of these and made sure they followed under the correct hierarchy here. So these are all of the potential Cloudflare proxies that you can use, or that Cloudflare will use to send data to your Home Assistant server. If you don't have these listed, Home Assistant will reject these as a bad proxy and you'll just get an error. When this is all done, you can click the Save button up here and that goes away. And then you will need to restart Home Assistant. So let's just do a real quick recap of where we are right now. We went in there and we created you already had a domain, you already had it pointed to Cloudflare. We created a subdomain, Mostlychris demo. We created an Origin SSL certificate and we added the certificate to the files using the terminal under Home Assistant. Then we went back into Home Assistant's file editor and we set up all the settings here to use the new certificates. We then went over to Cloudflare, got the list of proxy IP addresses and pasted those in here as well, because you need to have all those in there or it won't work. Then you do a restart of Home Assistant, always making sure that you do a configuration check first. So click on check configuration. If that turns out to be valid, then you do a restart and all of those settings should take place. Now, when you go from your domain, your remote or whatever you call it. So in my case, I would go from remote.mostlychrisdemo.com. It goes from my domain or from the internet to Cloudflare. Cloudflare picks that up, proxies it, and sends it over to Home Assistant. And from the beginning of the transaction on your browser all the way through Cloudflare's proxy to Home Assistant, you should have an SSL encrypted connection. Now, I will say there's another setting you probably want to set in Cloudflare to make sure that it is actually performing the way you think it should. And it's this setting right here. If you set this to flexible, which it defaults to, everything from here to Cloudflare is encrypted. You can see the padlock here. We don't want that. We want to make sure it's end-to-end encrypted. So make sure you set full, strict. Encrypts end-to-end, but requires a trusted CA or Cloudflare Origin certificate on the server. That's what we just did. So if you have everything set up correctly from your browser, encrypted to Cloudflare, like I said before, and from Cloudflare's proxy, encrypted to your Origin server, which is your Home Assistant, this whole path then becomes encrypted. Make sure you use strict, or it basically defeats the purpose of encrypting all that traffic. So now you have a working encrypted session all the way from browser to your Home Assistant instance over the internet. So that's all good and fine. You have this encrypted connection, but you probably want to secure that down a little bit further. Since you open the port on your firewall, anyone that goes to your IP address on your router and that port can potentially get into Home Assistant as well. So you want to do a little restriction. Now, this is going to be very dependent on your firewall that you're using. I'm using a Unify firewall. And in my Unify firewall, what I have done is I have blocked all traffic to Home Assistant not coming from those IP addresses. And again, this varies depending on your setup. So if we look at my rules here, I have a rule that accepts all Cloudflare proxies that are destined for the IP address of my Home Assistant instance. What that means is that if it's coming from Cloudflare, if we look over here, if it comes from here to Home Assistant, it will get through my firewall. I've opened a little hole for that. If it comes from the internet in general, anywhere else other than Cloudflare, it will not allow that to occur. Now, I'm not going to go into the details of how I set this up on my router because there's just too many different routers out there. What you want to make sure you do, and this is the concept, make sure that you only allow access to your Home Assistant instance on that port that you opened up in the router from the Cloudflare proxies. And the way that works for Unify or the USG router is I make sure all this happens before predefined rules. I have a port IP group that has all of those IP addresses that we listed here. Those are the only ones allowed to go through that port or that opening that I open in my firewall. And that's the group here. Everything else to this port gets dropped in another rule. So let it all in and then drop everything else. And that's how this is set up here. I'm not going to get into the whole thing about security and how everything should be set up in terms of securing your networks. I will talk about in a few minutes what I think about this method that we're talking about in relation to some other ones that we've used. So stay tuned for that. But for now, set up your firewall. Don't leave your Home Assistant instance open to the world unless you're comfortable with that risk. Make sure you set up some sort of firewall rules to only allow it to be accessed from the proxy. One final thing I can talk about here is using the Cloudflare firewall to block access from very specific areas. So what I can do here in this case is I can add a firewall filter or firewall rule, excuse me. I can add a rule, and this is US only. If I know I'm only going to be accessing Home Assistant from a US IP address, I can limit some of the attack vector. It's not going to be the best, right? You need to limit things that your firewall your ingress firewall on your network. What this does is it only allows traffic from from the proxy to be sent through if it originates from this firewall rule. So let's select country as a rule. So any incoming requests that match country, and we can select from the list here. Then we will allow it to happen, right? So when an incoming request matches country US, then allow that traffic through and we'll deploy that. Now, this could also potentially affect things that have to talk to your instance from other places, such as outbound or inbound, a rule for Google TTS or something like that. If you have services that have to talk to Home Assistant from outside, these rules that you're placing on your firewall and the rules that you're putting here will potentially affect that. So you may have to do some experimentation and see if that works okay for you. So now you can see I have a rule right here, and then you can actually see the activity that comes in and allows this. Okay, so that is basically how this works. You're taking your Home Assistant traffic from the internet, putting it over an HTTPS port on 2096, in my case, whatever port you used, proxying that through Cloudflare. Cloudflare then takes that and sends it on through to your local Home Assistant instance, encrypted because you have an Origin SSL certificate set up and you've enabled strict SSL rules so that it will only allow that traffic to go through if the Origin certificate matches. At the beginning of the video in the intro, I talked about various options that we have for connecting to Home Assistant. You've got VPN, you've got Duck DNS, you've got Nginx reverse proxy, you've got Nabu Casa, and now this Cloudflare setup. So which one am I using, or which ones do I recommend? Well, by far the simplest one is to use the Nabu Casa Cloud. And all you do is go into your configuration once you have a Nabu Casa account set up, and you just sign into it and everything is hooked up. You don't have to open any firewall ports. You don't have to do anything special. You get the added benefit of being able to control your devices using the smart speakers, Google or Amazon, because all of that's natively done within the cloud setup. For ease of use, this is probably the very best one. I am using actually my Duck DNS setup right now with my own domain. That requires me to open a port in my firewall, so that does open some risk for that. So that's the second one, the second option I have. Now, if you really want to be secure from end to end, you need to use a VPN. So you can use Tailscale or you can use WireGuard for those. Those are both I've talked about in my videos. Tailscale is a zero config setup. You just install the add-on and you set up an account at Tailscale and you connect your devices together. I can go directly to my Home Assistant device from my phone or computer or whatever I have Tailscale set up to on the other end, and it's a direct connection through a VPN. No issues with that at all. Super simple. So Nabu Casa is easy to set up. Tailscale is super easy to set up. Duck DNS is a little bit harder. You still have to have a domain name. Nginx reverse proxy is probably one of the harder ones. All you're doing there is forwarding stuff to your Home Assistant instance. Again, you've got to open up a port and come in from the outside to get to Home Assistant. And then it takes the domain and puts it where you want it to. You can access things internally on your local network using the Nginx reverse proxy. And I've talked about that in my videos. And then finally, this whole Cloudflare setup. This is probably the hardest one of all of them to do and would be useful in very specific use cases, but not for everybody. I'm demonstrating it today because it's another option to remotely connect to Home Assistant, and it might fit some advanced scenarios where you want to do something very specific to it. But for the average user, you probably want to stick with Nabu Casa or something along the lines of Duck DNS, or even, a VPN solution. So those are my thoughts. The little configuration setup for the Cloudflare. Let me know your comments down below in the comment section. And if you're not a channel member, consider joining the channel. It supports what I do here and helps me to be able to create these videos for you. And I do thank you for those that have already signed up as channel members. And you should see that scrolling over here somewhere here in a second. With that, I hope you enjoyed the video. Thumbs up and all that stuff. And we will see you on the next one.